Thanks so much for having me today, give this presentation. Like Amberly said, my name's Chloe Wright. I'm a PhD candidate at UBCO. And while what I'm going to present to you today forms the basis of my PhD dissertation research, it is definitely not my project. There are a ton of people and collaborators involved in this project, and we really couldn't do it without them. So I'm just going to start by acknowledging all of our collaborators. So we have the FLNRO, particularly the Fish and Wildlife Branch, the Bonaparte Indian Band, Okanagan Nations Alliance, BC Wildlife Federation, and the University of Idaho. So perhaps I don't even need to talk about this, but I always like to start off with, why do we even care about mule deer in BC? Why would we even want to spend time researching them? And so to begin with, they're a highly valued game species, as I'm sure you're all aware. So a study was conducted in 2013 in which a group interviewed resident hunters throughout BC, and they found that 75% of them sought to harvest at least one deer. And then they also found that those hunters spent about $130 million per year hunting deer. So to put that into perspective, that's about 35% of the total annual expenditures on hunting in the province are spent on deer alone. And so beyond just being a harvest species, they're also a vital part of the ecosystem. So they're a native species here to BC, and they're an important prey species for many predators. And then, of course, they're also an important source of food security and cultural practice for First Nations communities. And so we can see that mule deer are a highly valued species for multiple different stakeholder groups throughout the province. However, mule deer are suspected to be declining, and with these declines in some areas dating back as far as the 1950s. And in some of these areas, the decline is more severe perhaps than in other regions. However, unfortunately, it's really difficult to get population estimates of deer, particularly in a heavily forested area like Southern BC. So we often rely on other trend indices to help show kind of what's going on in the population. So these data sources include things like yearly harvest numbers and even anecdotal reports. So if we look at mule deer harvest numbers from Region 8 from the 80s until 2015, we can see a pretty sharp decline in harvest from about the early 90s until the early 2000s. We see a decline of about 50%. So about 5,000 deer being harvested per year in the early 90s, and then about 2,500 or less harvested in the early 2000s. And so this doesn't tell us that the deer population declined by 50% during this time, but it does give us a certain indication that the population was declining. By what percent, we don't really know. And so, like I mentioned before, we also suspect that deer populations are not declining in similar ways throughout the province. So there are definitely going to be areas where they're doing better and some areas where they're doing worse. And so it might seem to a lot of people that the obvious way to deal with declining deer numbers would just be to limit harvest, and then the population would recover, right? Just stop harvesting and we'll come back. But hunting regulations have become more restrictive over the years, and these declines in deer numbers are still continuing. So there's been quite a lot of research done in the US, particularly on mule deer populations and what might be impacting them the most. And these different studies have identified four main factors that can limit mule deer populations. And these are food, predators, landscape change, and weather. And so I'm going to touch on each of these super briefly. So food is perhaps the most important limiting factor identified in these studies. So forage quality and availability. So a study was conducted in the early 2000s in Colorado, in which they had two identical, well, as close to identical as you can get in the wild, two different populations of mule deer with similar predator assemblages, habitat, and that kind of thing. And in one population, they supplementally fed them over the winter, and in the other population, they did absolutely nothing. They just monitored survival. And what they found was that when they supplementally fed these deer in the wintertime, the deer population increased so much, both the survival of juveniles over the winter and the survival of adults, that it led to a population increase of about 6,000 deer being added to the population every year, just by supplementally feeding them in the wintertime. And so I like to point out that this doesn't, the focus of the study wasn't to say, hey, we should supplementally feed deer in the winter. That can have negative impacts on deer for a bunch of reasons, but a lot of those relating to disease. But the point of the study was just that they wanted to figure out if food was a limiting factor or if it was more related to predators or something like that. Yeah, so then another study in Idaho took a different route. So instead of increasing food, they tried to take away as many predators as they possibly could. And so we tend to think of predators as the main limiting factor for mule deer populations, but these studies have found that it's unlikely to be as important as food, particularly in undisturbed areas. So this study was done in Idaho in the early 2000s again, in which they had multiple populations of deer, again, very similar in terms of habitat and predator assemblages and things like that. And in the treatment areas, they removed as many coyotes and as many cougars as they possibly could. And then in the control areas, they did nothing. And what they found was that there was actually no significant increase in population growth in the treatment areas. So even though they removed all the cougars, well, they removed like 75% of the coyotes and 94% of the cougars, they didn't really see the population grow. So they did see small increases in neonate survival over the summer in those coyote treatment areas, but they found that it was really dependent on the amount of alternative prey in the region. So if there were a ton of alternative prey that year, then the effect of coyote reduction wasn't that big because the coyotes were mostly feeding on those alternative prey. And so those are the kinds of things that make it really difficult to tease apart how predator control might work or could work. Yeah, and then this study also did a cost estimate just to see if they went down this route, if they really wanted it to work, how much it would cost. And they found that it would cost about $1,500 US per deer to add 65 additional yearling males to the population over 10 years. And so there has been a decent amount of work on predators and mule deer, although this is one of the better done studies. And these studies suggest that predators don't usually cause decline in mule deer populations, but they can prevent or delay recovery after a decline. So there's a ton of things we could talk about when it comes to landscape change. I'm just going to touch on one because I'm not trying to, we don't want to be here for the next like 2 hours. But yeah, landscape change and fire patterns. So here in BC, this figure right here shows results from a study done in Southern BC about 10 years ago. And what they did was for a certain number of trees, they cut out a cross section and looked at burn scars on the tree ring sequence. And so then they could backdate when those fires happened on the landscape based on the tree rings. And looking at this figure, so the black bars are the burn scars, and we can see that there was quite a bit of low intensity fires that happened in the region up until about the 1950s. And then we see kind of fire is lost from the landscape after this time. And the reason this is important for mule deer is because fire can create high quality mule deer forage. So again, other work has shown that there's more plant protein in burned areas and more digestible plants in burned areas. And then the last thing I just want to touch on briefly is annual weather patterns. So we all know that winter severity can decrease over winter survival, right? If you have really severe winter, really deep snow, really cold, and it lasts a long time, obviously that has negative implications for fawn survival. But other work has also shown that summer precipitation can be really important as well. So this study in Idaho that did the predator control, they also looked at a bunch of other things, and they found that with low summer precipitation, fawns had above average mortality during the winter, even in a low snowfall winter. And so we can see that that could have a really big impact, and that's something that's obviously out of our control, but something important to bring up. So that brings us to the Southern Interior Mule Deer Project. And what we're really trying to do with this project is to try and increase mule deer population sizes in Southern BC through an evidence-based and cooperative approach to landscape management. So we're hoping to identify what the main drivers are of mule deer populations here where we are, and then hopefully provide management recommendations to try and reverse this decline. So we have 3 main study areas, which are the ones in blue: Cache Creek, West Okanagan, and Boundary. And then I'm sure you've all heard there's been a lot of collaring work done in the Kootenays as well on mule deer. And I'm going to try and incorporate those data in as many ways as I can, but in the Kootenays, they didn't collar any fawns or neonates, and so that makes it a little difficult to integrate into all of our objectives. But I just wanted to mention them so that you guys all know that we do know that there are mule deer being collared in the Kootenays. But yeah, our 3 main study areas are in blue. And then again, one of our main hypotheses is that fire could be beneficial for mule deer because it creates high quality forage. And so then our 3 different study areas were partially chosen because of the differing amounts of wildfire that's happened in the regions. So you can see the Cache Creek regions obviously almost entirely consumed by the Elephant Hill wildfire. The West Okanagan has a little bit of fire, and then the boundary very little. And I should say these are recent fires, so in the last 5 years. So within each of these 3 main study areas, our goal is to maintain a sample size of 30 adult females collared every year. So that doesn't mean we collar 30 new ones every year, it just means we need to have 30 collared throughout the year. And then to collar 20 juvenile deer per study area per year. And so the first year of the project, this was just 6-month-old fawns, so we just focused on those, and then we kind of had a change in methodology, or we decided to add a different part to the project, and so we started collaring neonates last year. And so this 20 juvenile cohort starts off with 20 neonates in the summer, and then 20 fawns over the winter time to monitor their survival. So we catch these deer at different times depending on what age class they are. So the adults, the first year when we started the project, we started in March of 2018, and that was the first time we put collars out, and those were all on adult females. And then we do the rest of the collaring every other year since then. It's been November to February of 2019, 20, and 21. This was our last season. And then 6-month-old fawns, again, we catch those early in the winter because we're trying to measure that overwinter survival, which is shown to be really variable depending on the year and the region. And then, so this last winter was our last winter of 6-month-old fawn captures. And then for neonates, we did a pilot study in June of 2019. We were just trying to see if it was even feasible for, given the size of our study areas and the limited personnel we have, we wanted to know if it was even possible to catch neonates. So in June of 2019, we did a small capture that went really well. And so then in June of 2020, we did our first full neonate season, and then we have one more coming up this June. So we catch the adults and 6-month-old fawns using 3 main techniques. So the first one being helicopter capture. We also do some ground darting when we run out of helicopter money. And then we also use clover traps. And so clover traps are just a netted cage that a deer walks into. The door closes and then they are stuck, but that's okay. So once we have the deer restrained, either chemically through the darting or physically, we take a bunch of samples and measurements as well as putting the collar on. So we draw blood to test for pregnancy and other diseases. We pull hair, a fecal sample. We look for ticks and then collect, well, not just ticks, any parasite, and then we collect them. And then we also take a bunch of body measurements and a weight. And then we also put in an ear tag in all the deer. And so we do collar 6-month-old fawns that are males, just because it would take a very long time if we only did females. So it is possible that you could harvest a deer with an ear tag in it one day. And if you do, it probably won't have a collar anymore because the collars will fall off. But you should give the RAP line a call with a number, and then we can give you more information about that deer if you're interested. Yeah, so that's how we catch the adults and all the 6-month-old fawns and kind of what we do to them. And then for neonate capture, it's totally different, right? Because it would be impossible to catch neonates using a helicopter, as much fun as that might be to try. So what we do is we use the doe locations from the collared deer, and we use that to pinpoint birthing sites. So this is about 2 days of locations for a deer this past end of May. And you can see in 2 days, these are hourly fixes. You can see she's moved quite a bit throughout the landscape, not really clustering in any one specific area. So we would look at this in the morning and say, nah, she hasn't given birth yet, we're just going to move on. But then a few days, we check them every day, and we look for these kinds of localizations, right? So you can see the huge difference in movements between this 2 days worth of locations versus this 2 days worth of locations. She's in a tightly clustered area. Those points over here that are just like shooting out, those are likely just collar error. This deer gave birth in kind of like a bluffy area near a river, so the collar probably just had a hard time there. But yeah, so we would see this, we check every morning, be like, okay, this deer is given birth, and then we go to this cluster and we just walk. And so we form grid lines of people, and you just go back and forth until hopefully you find the neonate. And so this was really fun this summer for me. I had a great time. We got to go to a bunch of different habitat types, which was cool to see the different places they're giving birth. Sometimes it's a really nice walk in the woods, and other times it's really not a great time. But we still found the neonate in this picture, and so that's awesome, this center picture. There's also a neonate in one of these pictures, and if this was a live presentation, I'd have somebody try and guess, but I can't. So there's a neonate right here in the corner, not a great hider. So then once we have the neonates in hand, we do take a couple of measurements. The most important thing we do is weigh them, and that's because we need the collar to be less than 3% of its body weight when we put it on. So if the neonate doesn't weigh enough, then we don't collar them, and that's because we never want to suspect that the collar is impacting their survival. So after we weighed them and we verified that they weigh enough, we put the collar on. That's the most important thing, and then we take a couple other measurements, but it's really non-invasive, and we don't pull blood, we don't take fecal, we don't put an ear tag in. So we try to be as non-invasive as we can with these little guys. We do pull some hair, but yeah, so then the 3 different age classes of deer wear 3 pretty different collars. The adults weigh the heaviest collar and the collar that stays on the longest. So we only put these collars on adult females. This collar weighs about 650 grams, and it'll last anywhere from 3 to 4 years. It has 2 D batteries inside of it. We've had pretty good luck with these collars. And so these ones are pretty similar to the 6-month-old fawn collars, which are here in the middle. Except you can see the 6-month-old fawn collar is a little smaller. It weighs 450 grams, and it has an expandable neck belt, and that's because the fawns can still grow, obviously, between that first winter and then previous years for them. And when we collar the 6-month-old males, we put another strip on there that's just a small piece of denim, and that way it'll rip and fall off as the deer ages, and then we don't have to worry about the collar choking out the bucks as they get bigger. And then the neonates get the most different collar. These ones only weigh 140 grams, and their neck belting is completely made out of elastic that's sewn like an accordion. So you can see in this picture here, some of the stitching has come undone, and then that's how it grows, right? So as the neck swells and gets bigger, then those stitches come out, and then the collar fits around the deer. And then that only lasts for about a year if we're lucky, and then falls off. And so that collar only takes a fix, well, it only transmits a fix once a day, whereas the other ones take a fix every 4 hours and send those every 16 hours. So we get quite a lot of locations from the 2 collars and not very many from the neonates. So then for mortality investigations, we get a notification when the collar has been stationary. It's 4 hours for the neonate collars, 6 hours for the other 2. And we try to get there as fast as we can because we're trying to figure out at least the proximate cause of mortality for these deer. And so this right here, I'm sure many of you can see the deer in this picture. This is a pretty classic cougar kill. It's been cached. And there's its head and my old lab mate Emily. And what we do, especially for the adults, we always try to pull the head so we can get a tooth to age them, as well as the lymph nodes to look for CWD. We send that off to the health lab, and then we pull a long bone as often as we can, and that lets us look at bone marrow, which is another indicator of body condition at death. So we've had a total of 381 captures in the last 3 years, which is crazy. That's such a big number. We started in spring of 2018, just trying to catch as many adults as we could. And this was even before I started on the project. I didn't start until that September. And then that next winter was our first winter. And you can see that we did really well getting our full sample of fawns in the West Okanagan and the Boundary, not as much in Cache Creek. But then, we learned, we adapted, we changed. And so in winter 2019 and 20, we pretty much got our full sample of fawns in all 3 study areas and then kept adding our adults to the sample as they died. And then same with this past winter, which again was our last winter of 6-month-old fawn captures anyways. And you can see that again, we caught pretty much all the fawns we needed to, and some more adults as well. And actually this past winter, we still had some neonates collared from over the summer. So our sample sizes are actually a bit higher than 20 in some of these areas. Yeah. For neonates, again, the first summer was just a pilot, so we targeted 5 in the Okanagan and in Cache Creek, and we hit that sample. And then last year we tried to get 20 in each region, and we did. So that was really exciting. And then, yeah, we have one more summer to go. So right now we have 179 deer with collars on. You can see the breakdown here. We do have a lot of adults in some of the regions, and that's just because some of the fawns age up to yearlings, and then they're still alive and their collar's still working, so then they age up to adults. Yeah. So now I'm going to get into some preliminary results. What you're looking at right here is cumulative annual adult survival in the Okanagan. And so this is from April 1st to March 31st. And it's all the years combined. And I did that because when I broke it up by year, there really wasn't a difference. And so we get our best estimate when we have all of our deer together in the sample. And so you can see in the Okanagan, it was 85%. In Cache Creek, pretty much identical at 85%. And in the Boundary, a little bit lower at 75%. Confidence intervals do overlap a bit, but you know, survival does appear to be lower in the Boundary for adults than the other two regions. And so you're probably wondering how this compares to other studies. So there was a study done on mule deer in the West Kootenays in the early 90s, no, excuse me, the early 2000s. And there it was 72%, so similar to our Boundary region. And yeah, so a little bit on the low end. In Idaho, that mule deer survival study they did with the predator control, their annual adult survival was 89%, so really close to where we are with our other two. And then there was a lit review done in 2013 in which they looked at all the studies that have been done up to that point, and the average adult survival was 84%. So pretty much smack on with what we have at least in 2 of our regions. So for fawn survival, this is 6-month-old fawn survival here, kind of a similar thing, but it starts in December and goes until June. And if you've seen me give this talk before, you're actually probably super bored because it's not very different from what I gave back in November, but you'll notice perhaps that these figures are a little different for fawn survival. And that's because what I decided to do was pool all the different years together, partially because we're still not quite through this year's data collection. I just went and picked up a dead deer yesterday, so I didn't want to like give those numbers out yet before the winter is over, before we have a clear idea of what's going on. So I just pooled all of them together. So this is the last 3 winters up until now anyways in the Okanagan, and you can see overwinter fawn survival is 61%. In the Cache Creek region, it's 60%, and in the Boundary region, it's 68%. And so again, if you've seen my other talks or other presentations, you'll remember in the Boundary, the first year survival was really low. It was like 30% or something like that. And then last year it was quite a bit higher, up at like 90%, which was crazy. And then this year we're kind of back in the middle. So that just kind of shows that survival for these guys is incredibly variable over time. But I just pulled them for these, and you can see that, yeah, they're all pretty similar when you pool all the years together. And you can see that the biggest decline in survival is here between February and March. You can see a pretty sharp decline in all of these figures. And that makes sense because that's kind of the hardest time for little deer. They're just hoping to make it through the winter, and sometimes they don't. So this is neonate survival, and so this is a bit different because this is actual like weeks of life. So this figure is survival from the day they're born until they're 12 weeks old. And we can see that in the West Okanagan, 12-week neonate survival was 46% last year. In Cache Creek, it was 44%, and in the Boundary region, it was 29%. So a bit lower there again, but those confidence intervals are quite large. And that's just because we collared 20, and 20 is a good number, but more data is always better. So hopefully this summer we'll get our full sample size and we can pool these together, and then we'll have a better idea of kind of what's going on in these 3 regions. And so again, you're probably wondering how this compares to other studies. Are we really low or really high? And it turns out we're kind of like right where everyone else is again. So in Colorado, their 12-week survival was 48%. In Idaho, it was 45%. In California, actually a bit lower, it was about 33%. And what's interesting is that these study areas, or these regions, all have pretty similar predator assemblages to ours. But I think it's always interesting to bring up that where I did my master's degree, I did it on white-tailed deer in Missouri. And in Missouri, there's only coyotes and bobcats and there's nothing else. So there's no bears, which is kind of the most important thing. And we found that 12-week survival was 40%. So pretty similar, despite having one major less category of predator. And then there's also a study recently done in Delaware, which is on the eastern coast of the United States in the northeast coast. And there's no predators there at all. And they verified this through baited camera traps. They were trying to find any coyotes that might be there. They had none, which is kind of hard to fathom. But their 12-week neonate survival was 44%. And they found that most of their deer in those first 12 weeks died from disease. And so it just goes to show that there's a ton of things that could be impacting survival at this young age. So for mortality sources, this is just adult females and fawns. We've had 81 predation events and then 27 unknowns. And so you can see cougar predation is definitely our most numerous cause of mortality at 42. And then kind of a smattering of other things, coyotes, wolves. Some things are called probable, and that's just because we didn't have enough definite evidence that they were predated upon by that predator. Yeah, so anyways, cougars number one there, but we'll learn more from Siobhan coming up about cougar predation. So for neonates, it's a bit different, right? Because at this age, they're really small, they don't outrun predators, and so they just kind of sit there and wait to get eaten. And so there's a lot of things that try to eat them, as it turns out. So bears were our number one cause of mortality, but we also had 15 deer that we just had no idea what killed them. And you might think, wow, you guys are really bad at this, but these guys are so small, and this caller, it does send us a notification after 4 hours, but sometimes the predators will be there and they just munch everything before you can even get there, even if you get there the same day, and all you'll find is some bone fragments and a collar and nothing else. And because it's summer, it's really hard to tell predator sign unless they poo everywhere, which is what bears do, and so that kind of makes it easier to at least identify the bears, whereas the other ones, there's often not very much left. And then also interesting to know, we went to about probably like 40 different clusters this summer looking for neonates, and we did come across one stillborn, so it was pretty sad. So in terms of collar data, we've collected over 800,000 locations. We'll definitely be above the million mark by this time next year. Well, not even, in a couple months. And on average, we have about 2,000 locations per deer. Obviously, there's some deer that have been collared since March of 2018, and those deer have like 7,000 locations. And then the ones that just got collared don't have very many. Yeah, so for just some preliminary movement stuff, we've found that about 75% of the deer we've collared have been migratory. They tend to start in mid-May and end by late May, so not super long time for migrations. It's usually about a week or two and they're done. And in the fall, they start in early October and end by mid-October. But these do change every year. We see some variation in terms of when they start and stop. And those fall migrations tend to be some of them can be quite long. So I've seen a couple of deer in the boundary specifically that start migrating in October, and they don't get all the way back to their winter range until like January. And so they're using some stopover sites before they get all the way back. So there's a lot of variation actually in this as well, but I just wanted to provide some general ideas of what's going on. So in terms of the average distance they travel, it's about 40 to 60 kilometers, so a little shorter in the Okanagan than the other two regions, but we've still seen really long distance migrators in the Okanagan. So you can see these are all about 100 kilometers being our largest migrants. And yeah, so these are considered mid-range migrators, so they don't migrate the longest that's ever been recorded. That record is 410 kilometers, which is in Wyoming, if you can even imagine that. But these deer still move about 13 to 20 kilometers farther than in some other regions. And I just wanted to show you two of our longest migrants in the boundary because I think they're really cool. These are two fawns, actually 6-month-old fawns, and they walked pretty much all the way from Highway 3 all the way up to Highway 6. So that's just a really long distance, and you can see that purple one, she crossed up and over into the Granby and then popped out on the highway. So anyways, pretty cool. So this right here, hopefully will play. This is a movement video of deer migrating last spring. So this starts on April 15th of last year, and you'll see all the dots are different deer moving around. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so the different colors are different deer, and this is early April. You can see a couple of deer starting to move beginning of May now, and they're really getting started. A big pulse here in mid-May. And yeah, by June, they're kind of, sorry, now it keeps going. Anyways, by mid-June, they're all pretty much where they need to be for the summer. And then, sorry, this is the same thing, but in the fall. So this starts on September 1st, and you'll see everybody on their summer range, and then we can see them start to come back. So we see a bit of movement here early September. Kind of a pretty big pulse there, beginning of October. Oh, here comes everyone, mid-October. And some stragglers at the end. And this brings us to about mid-November. There we go. And you can see these deer, there's still a couple hanging out up high. And these are the ones I was talking about that tend to be, they kind of use some stopover sites over here, which is pretty neat. So some of them don't come back, like I said, until like January. Another neat thing that we've seen, and it's not unique, like a lot of other research has shown this for mule deer, but it still always blows my mind, I think. I know it does. That they have really high site fidelity to their migration pathways. So this is one deer, 4 seasons. So it's 2 spring migrations and 2 fall migrations. That's what the different colors are. And you can see that she pretty much steps exactly where she stepped the last season and the last year. And this really blows my mind, particularly for me, because I'm really terrible at navigating out in the woods personally. And if in the wintertime, the only way I can walk the exact same way I came back is by the snow. But yeah, these deer, they don't need it. They have really great memories. Yeah. So I just spent like 30 minutes talking about so many things, but I never once mentioned camera traps, but that is a large portion of this project. And I think one of the more exciting things about this project. And so that's all led by PhD student Sam Foster at the University of Idaho, but he's actually Canadian, he's from the Shuswap. But yeah, Sam and his large team of volunteers have been putting out these camera traps on mule deer summer range and winter range. And so hopefully you guys have gotten involved in that. And if you're looking for something to do, Sam's always looking for volunteers who are looking to go for a hike and put a camera out or retrieve a camera, things like that. So you can contact Sam if you're interested in volunteering. And Sam's cameras will give us an idea of what else is going on the landscape, right? Because these colors tell us what's happening to the deer and what the deer are doing, but it doesn't tell us anything about what's going on in the places where the deer are. And so these cameras will give us a good idea of other competitors in the region. So it could be like elk or whitetail deer, and then also the all-important predators. So are we seeing more cougar predation in some areas than others because there are relatively more cougars in that region or another? Or maybe there aren't, maybe there's similar numbers, but something else is going on. And so these are kind of the things that hopefully Sam's cameras will be able to tease apart for us. Yeah, but Sam is still very much working through getting all of the data. It's been a like Herculean effort. So he doesn't quite have any preliminary results yet, but I know that when he does, hopefully it will be pretty soon. It'd be great. He'd be a great person to have talk. Yeah, and then in terms of what I still have to do, it's a lot. So I have one more summer of neonate capture coming up. We'll continue to identify all the mortalities that we can, or investigate all the mortalities that we can. And then I have a ton of data analysis to do. So I get to spend a lot of time at my computer so that I can tease apart what's going on with these deer and other factors that are related to their survival. And so that hopefully in coming months and years for sure, I'll have a more interesting story to tell you, or not story, but I'll have some more facts to share with you beyond just the same things I feel like I always keep saying. Yeah, so theoretically I will be done by the fall or the winter of 2022. Yeah, so there's still a lot more to come. And with that, I just wanted to acknowledge again everybody that's helped on this project. So all the logos on this project have, well, they all belong to organizations, and they've all donated money or time or both. And we're so grateful, because without them, we wouldn't be able to do this project. So a big thanks to them. And with that, I am done now. Oh, and just one thing, here's some literature. If you guys are interested in any of the things that, reading any of the papers that I cited, they're all here. And if you can't access them because they're behind a paywall, just send me an email and I'd be happy to share the paper with you. There's a lot of great literature out there about mule deer if you're interested. Now I really am done.
Awesome job, Chloe. That was really, really great. Everybody, I'm just going to give you a little reminder. Put your questions in the Q&A. Vote up questions that you like. And at the end of Siobhan's presentation, we will move into the Q&A portion of things. So thank you, Chloe. Siobhan, are you online with us?
Yes. Can you see me?
I can see you.
Can you hear me?
And we can hear you too.
See my screen?
Yeah, your screen looks perfect.
Wonderful.
All right, I'm going to let you roll.
Great. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here tonight to talk about the Southern BC Cougar Project. This is one of my very first talks, talking about the first year of the study. And it was really great having Chloe give an introduction to a lot of the themes that we're working on in our project. So my name is Siobhan Darlington, and I'm a PhD student at the University of British Columbia. I'm working with Dr. Adam Ford and Karen Hodges. And I started in January 2020, so I don't have quite as many snazzy results as Chloe, but I'm happy to talk about the objectives of our study today and our collaborators and some of our future steps that we're going to be taking in the next few years to answer some really interesting research questions. And also give a little bit of a sneak preview of some of the trends we've seen in the first year. So to start off, I'll just talk about some big picture ideas and then get into the objectives of the project. Okay, so some of you may or may not be aware that cougars have been expanding their range eastward in the last several decades. So you might not know that cougars used to occur all across North America. And as far as where I'm from in Nova Scotia, and even today, people still say that they see cougars in their backyard. It's usually a house cat. But the truth is they are actually recolonizing parts of the Midwest in the US. So this is a relatively recent map from 2015 of the cougar range in North America. And you can see it's really restricted to the western side of the continent. And that's because of intensive persecution of apex predators in the 19th and 20th century, where bounties were put on cougars and they were essentially extirpated from much of their range. And there's a small population that exists today, the Florida panther, that's really isolated. But now there's more cougars breeding and returning to areas in the Dakotas. And even though it doesn't show on this map, there's currently a breeding population in southwestern Saskatchewan in the Cypress Hills that was really just discovered in the last 10 years. So they are starting to colonize farther east again. And the mechanisms behind this are to do with habitat and female dispersal. So if there's habitat that's suitable and habitat is connected, cougars can establish further east. And that really has to do with females gradually dispersing and occupying these habitats and males finding these cats. And then over time, these populations establish. But what I want to point out is that we don't know a lot about other opportunities for cougars to expand their range. And one of the questions coming out of some recent work with prey for cougars is whether cougars may be expanding their range northward as well. So their primary prey include mule deer and white-tailed deer have been expanding the limits of their northern range in the past 50 or 60 years in North America. And this has implications for other vulnerable prey. So we don't really understand how increases in whitetails might promote predation by cougars on other vulnerable populations like mule deer or caribou and some other ungulates. So some of the drivers of deer expansion have a lot to do with habitat as well. So changes in the landscape from forestry and roads, also different amounts of snow. So winter severity, like Chloe mentioned before, is a huge predictor too of deer survival. And it seems that white-tailed deer are able to colonize and establish farther north and survive harsher winters more easily now with climate change. So we're learning a lot about how the landscape affects deer populations, but we don't really understand how that affects predators as well. So I just want to show you too, just a quick map. So you can see the cougar map here and then whitetails and mule deer. So we have a really exciting opportunity to study cougars' relationships with different prey, including whitetails and mule deer in southern British Columbia. So we have areas where we're studying cougars, where we have quite a few whitetails that have been established for a long time, and different amounts of prey that we're learning about across different study areas in the interior. So one of the things I've been talking about is landscape, but cougar populations are also affected from top-down processes, and this has to do with removing animals directly from the system. So if we think about management of cougars, we manage them for a lot of reasons. So we have hunter harvest, but we also have conservation officers that have to remove cougars for livestock conflict or conflict with pets or people. So cougars are removed from the system due to interactions with people. They're also removed from the system with competition between them and other predators, but their populations are also affected from bottom-up processes. So starting from things like landscape change that affects vegetation, and that reverberates through prey populations up to predators. So I just want to kind of reiterate this food web and explain how complex the predator-prey dynamic is and how these populations are influenced by many things. So when we think about cougars and their prey, we often think about cougars predating deer, and deer are herbivores and eat the plants, and this is how this relationship works. But one important thing to consider is that ungulates make up about 80% on average of the biomass of cougar diet, and that's across most studies in North America. They eat a lot of small mammals too. So this is about 20% of their diet. It depends on the individual, it depends on the season, but they do make up a significant portion of the food that they eat. So cougars are predating a quite diverse diet. They're pretty opportunistic. But they also share the landscape with many other predators. So they're sharing the landscape with wolves, and they have to compete with wolves for which ungulates they can eat. And there are bears and coyotes that they interact with as well. And many of these interactions are direct and also indirect. So cougars supply a lot of food resources to scavenger communities. So by killing a mule deer and caching it for later, they're providing a subsidy or food resource to animals like black bears, coyotes, and birds of prey. So we're learning throughout this project as well just how complex and entangled this system is. And another factor that we need to consider is that people play a huge role in this, and we affect this food web at every level. So we interact with the landscape, and we cause differences in vegetation due to forestry or oil and gas extraction in some places. There's natural systems at play too, like wildfire and beetle bark disease infestations, also climate change. And we also manage a lot of these animals through hunting and other management, like I talked about before. So what I'm trying to say is that the relationship between cougars and deer is more complex than just that one link. There are many linkages that we need to address. So let's look at, like I said, some of the management that happens with cougars in British Columbia. So some of you may be aware of compulsory inspections for cougars. So we get a lot of data out of this. And this map that I'm showing here is a combination of hunter harvest records and sightings and museum records over the past 30 to 40 years. And you can see the locations are really centered around where there's people that actively hunt. What you can't see on this map is that many of these more northern locations have occurred in just the last 10 to 15 years. So we're seeing more and more sightings and harvest locations occurring farther north. So what we're learning about cougars in the south could have important implications for prey populations in other parts of the province. But cougars are managed for livestock depredation, wildlife conflict, like I mentioned, also with caribou conservation. So they were a primary predator of the Selkirk caribou in BC in the early 2000s, and there's some concerns around the central mountain caribou populations as well. And we're also trying to manage cougars so that we have a sustainable harvest. So just for Region 8, there's figures like this for many regions, but just to focus on our area, this is our hunter harvest data going back to the 90s up until 2018. So this is showing a very similar trend to the mule deer trend that Chloe showed, in that there was a peak kind of in the late 90s, coinciding a bit with the mule deer in harvest for cougars, and then we see a decline into the early 2000s. And our levels haven't really increased much in this time. You can see the breakdown between conservation officer service takes and also non-resident and resident hunters. So we can use this data. So hunter harvest data is really valuable. It tells us a lot about age and sex ratios. We can learn about how many animals are being taken every year and where they're being taken. So this is really helpful in monitoring the population, and we can create some models to estimate abundance. So this is a spatial population reconstruction model. This is from the government. A contractor created this. But you can see, again, that spike in the late 90s in cougars and this decline. And it looks like they might be increasing in 2015. But what I want to point out is that we don't have a lot of confidence in this estimate, and we really need more data. So these bars are showing the confidence intervals around these estimates. So there could be 600 cougars in the Okanagan in 2015, or there could have been up to 1,200. So we really need more information so we can make better decisions and they're well informed for sustainable harvest levels. So why do we need to study cougars? They're really elusive and they're difficult to monitor. So I don't know how many people have seen a cougar. My first cougar that I definitively saw was during this project. I saw one in the distance in Alberta once running across the road that I'm pretty sure wasn't a deer, but people don't see them that often. We don't see them either from helicopter surveys as well because they stick to the forest. So we need more information. We need more data on population size and densities in BC, learning more about their age structure, those sex ratios. So this is really valuable data that we get from hunter harvest data, but we also get a bit of a bias there because we're not getting data from cats that aren't harvested. And as you would think, there are more males generally that are harvested than females. So we don't get a full picture of the cougar population unless we can study them some other way. And with the harvest data, we really don't know much about reproduction and recruitment since you can't hunt cougars with kittens. So we really need to learn more about recruitment into the population. How many kittens are born every year, how many survive to their first year, and how many are immigrating into the population. Cougars are also very important predators of large ungulates like mule deer. And we really don't know a lot about how landscape change is affecting cougar populations. So when we think about wildfire affecting Chloe's deer, what does that mean for cougars? Are cougars able to better hunt deer in certain features? So there are a lot of questions that we don't really have answers to. And I just wanted to pull this up again. So Chloe's hunter harvest figure that she showed, you can see there's a bit of a lag. So a peak in the 90s for mule deer and then this decline. But we do see a similar, just a couple of years later, the same pattern arising with cougars. So it could be that I think it's unlikely that cougars are causing this decline since their numbers aren't insanely high leading up to that decline. But there might be a landscape scale influence that's affecting both of these species. I saw in the chat someone mentioned winter severity. That could have been a factor too. So it's important to look at these factors. And just a reminder too, Chloe already showed this figure, but just that mule deer survival she's finding is a bit lower in the boundary, and that cougar predation seems to be the major cause, especially in the boundary, of her mule deer dying. So I just wanted to pull this up. This is from the SIMDeer project, and this is just a breakdown of the different mortality causes from different sources, different predators. You can see the yellow are definitive cougar kills and likely or possible cougar kills, but there's a clear difference here between the sheer numbers of mule deer predated by cougars in the boundary compared to the West Okanagan, where they share more predation with coyotes. So our project can really be useful in trying to answer some of these questions. What is it about the boundary that, you know, cougars are able to predate mule deer more effectively? Are there fewer coyotes there, or less competition? What are the answers to some of those questions? So I'm just going to pull up 3 research questions. I have many in my dissertation, but just to focus on a couple. How does landscape change, like I've been talking about, wildfire, roads, or forestry, and also harvest pressure, how does that affect cougar habitat use? So do cougars avoid roads certain times of the year? The ones that are not harvested, what do they do to avoid being harvested? Do they predate certain prey like mule deer associated with certain landscape features? Do they specifically choose cut blocks because there's lots of deer there? What other prey make up their diet? Do they specialize in mule deer predation, or do they only eat mule deer in proportion to their availability? So that's an important distinction. We need to know not just that they're killing lots of mule deer, but would we expect them to kill that many mule deer? And also what other species are part of this relationship. So in that food web, I talked about coyotes and black bears as scavengers. So that could have an effect on cougar kill rates. So if cougars are losing their food to competition with black bears, wolves, or coyotes, does that mean they have to hunt more to make up for the loss of energy? So I'll just show you a map of our 3 study areas. You'll see that 2 of them overlap with Chloe's project. And our target is to collar 30 cougars across these 3 study areas, so 10 in each one. So you can see we also have the Kootenay study area. One of the motivations to study the Kootenays is because there's a lot of cougar hunting there too. And there's a lot more whitetails. There's a different abundance of elk. There seems to be more species diversity in the Kootenays. So it's just a really different system that we're working with compared to the boundary and the West Okanagan. There's also far more wolves in the Kootenays, we believe, than in the boundary and especially in the West Okanagan. So there's some really interesting differences between the 3 study areas. And you can see in the map here the distribution of recent cut blocks and fire. They're pretty similar across each of these areas. Unfortunately, we don't have cougars collared in the Cache Creek area where there's just much more recent fire, but we do have some of that in the West Okanagan in the south. Okay, so our first objective, so we have 4 objectives trying to answer some of these research questions, is to look at basic population dynamics. What are survival rates of these cougars? So we can monitor these cougars over several years and find out what the sources of mortality are, and also survival of young. We can look at reproductive rates. So how many females are giving birth every year? How many kittens do they have in a litter? And how many kittens survive until their first year? We can calculate territory sizes, and we might have different predictions for each study area in terms of how much land or space a cougar uses, and whether or not certain features like roads might constrict their territory size. Do major highways pose a barrier to cougars and their territory? We can try to look at population densities. That's really helpful with Sam Foster's work, is having this camera grid out in 2 of the study areas. And in the Kootenays, there's also a camera grid run by the regional biologist there. So we have camera grids in all 3 areas where we're working with cougars. And we can see what the different prey relative abundances are, and also other predators using cameras. We can look at harvest rates across all 3 study areas and see if there's any differences. And we can look at the compulsory inspection data as well. So we can look at mortality from our cats that are collared, and also the CI data, and see if the current harvest strategy might have an effect on population dynamics, because the goal is really to have sustainable harvest. And if you don't know how many cougars are there, it can be really difficult to know whether or not the harvest levels are in fact sustainable. Okay, so how do we catch cougars and how are we monitoring them? So we have a wonderful team of houndsmen and women who are helping us out on this project. Amberly's husband is one of them, and it's been a really fun adventure the last 2 winters trying to find cats. And we've had some really interesting challenges as well along the way. But essentially, we hike out and snowshoe and snowmobile and use our trucks and go out in the winter and look for fresh cougar tracks. And when we find a fresh track, we bring a hound there. And if the dogs pick up the scent, they can tree the cat and we can immobilize the cat in the tree. So they're immobilized and then we can take a bunch of samples. So it sounds easy, but it's really actually fairly difficult and exhausting. But it's a lot of fun when we finally do get a cat. We're not always successful when we run a track, but we have successfully collared 26 adults and sub-adult cougars since we started. The first cat we collared was December 13th or 14th in 2019, so just before I started my PhD. We were able to get a few cats collared, and we take a number of samples as well. So we fit a GPS collar that transmits locations every 2 hours. And then we measure the cat, we get their weight, we put an ear tag in them and take a biopsy sample in the ear. We also take a blood sample if we can and pull some hair. So we get DNA and we can learn about their health and body condition. We get their sex and age as well. And then we can also monitor females that are pregnant, see if they're lactating, and then follow through to find out if they've had a litter. And we've successfully ear tagged 5 kittens so far on the project this way. So monitoring females that we've collared and tracking down her litter and ear tagging the kittens. So I'll talk about that more in a second. But just to show you, we've had 20 adult females and 6 adult males. So a lot more females than males collared so far. We have 16 that are currently online. So we've had a number of collar failures since the project started. We have gotten data on all of the cats, which is great, but some of the collars aren't lasting as long as we hoped. But we found out today that we are getting them replaced. So that's very exciting. We had 1 dropped collar. So the rod off strip, similar to Chloe's deer collars, came off on one of the cougar collars. We've had 3 mortalities so far on the project. 1 was from livestock conflict, hunter harvest, and 1 was from possible poisoning. So again, those failed collars, but just to break it down by the study area, we've had a lot of success in the West Okanagan. So we've had 14 cats collared and 8 are currently online. We have 2 in the boundary, which is where we're having the most trouble getting cats and where we will be focusing in the future. And then in the Kootenays, we've collared 10 cats and we have 6 currently online. And this picture on the right here just shows how we age the cougars. So not everybody knows this, but you can look at gum recession in the cougar. So seeing how much the gum line has receded here to estimate the age, and also look at the degree of staining on the teeth. So if there's a lot of heavy yellow staining, usually that means the cat's older. We've had a couple of cats that are 9 or 10 years old and their teeth are just rotting. The canines are broken off. It's really a sight to behold. But young cats have really nice white teeth and very little gum recession. And this is just a photo of taking the blood also from one of the forearms. But I just want to show you guys how much information we can get from collaring a female cougar, especially. So males and females give us lots of information about where they live and their diet and all of that. But if we collar a female, we can also learn about reproduction. So this is a cat, C10, that we collared in the boundary study area last year. We collared her in February, I think, and we put cameras up at her kill sites after that. So I was able to use her GPS data to hike into her clusters, investigate what she was eating. In this lower picture, that was a case where she had killed a white-tailed deer and cached it. And my partner came out with me in the winter and we put up a camera facing the carcass. And a month later, I came to check it. And I found pictures of our cat on the camera and she was with a tom. So we were able to pick up this really interesting behavior between her and a tom, and it seems that they mated during this time. And 3 months later, I was able to follow, this is the gestation period for cats, follow her GPS data and locate a litter and her in the den. So that was very exciting. And similar to Chloe's deer, you see this huge clustering of GPS data when a cougar gives birth. But what's interesting, and the difference between the nursery sites and den sites versus a kill, is that there's just way more locations. She spends weeks at a time when she initially gives birth in one spot. And then you can see this sort of star pattern in the telemetry. So while she's nursing her young, she's killing something close by and coming back and forth to the kill. So this location up here was a kill, and this one down here. And she was traveling back and forth so that she could continue to nurse her kittens, but also consume some prey while she was doing that. So when we look for nursery sites using telemetry data, we're looking for this star pattern. And cougars give birth primarily from June into September, but they could give birth any time of year. So I monitored and went into the site and found her den site, and she's actually giving birth inside of a slash pile on the edge of a cup block. And I heard about this from a biologist in Alberta. They had similar things happen with their cougars over there, where they found cougar kittens in slash piles in some spots. So I was able to get a picture of her. This is inside the den. I have a really long lens, so I wasn't that close. Put up some cameras and left her alone. And then 30 days later, approximately, when the kittens were 4 weeks old, we returned. She had a new den location in a different slash pile, and we were able to tag her 2 kittens. She had a male and a female. And then this little video here is from us monitoring them using cameras afterwards. So we were able to put cameras up on her kills and see her kittens coming to the kills and spending time with their mother. And we can monitor whether or not they're still alive this way. So I can see their ear tags in the videos. So really going from just collaring a female to having these kittens tagged. Hopefully in the summer, these kittens are still alive, and then I can put collars, adult collars on these kittens when they're a year old. Okay, our second objective is to look at habitat use. So I already talked about this a little bit, but using this telemetry data to look at the kind of habitat that they're living in. So whether they use burns or cup blocks, whether they cross roads a lot. So I can look at questions like that. I can also look at seasonal movements and compare some of the migrations of Chloe's mule deer to our cougar locations as well, because our cougars seem to be moving a bit seasonally when I look at the data, and I haven't analyzed it yet. But it's possible the cougars might be following their prey onto the summer range or changing their habitat use with their prey in the summer. So those are questions that I can look at. But here I really want to show you the power of having Chloe's project and my project occurring at the same place at the same time. So this was an incident where one of Chloe's mule deer that she collared in 2019 made a couple of migrations, and one of my collared cats ended up predating one of her deer. And we were able to capture this with our telemetry. So that was really exciting. Chloe let me know that one of her deer died. This was back in the summer. And I thought, oh, one of my cats lives there. Why don't I go check it out? And we went and hiked in, and my cat's collar wasn't working very well at the time, so I had to manually track her, and I could hear the beeping of the collar, but she wasn't very close. So I put up a cellular camera onto the kill and actually detected the cat coming in. And then a few months later, we ended up recollaring this cat, and we got all of the data back. I put a new collar on her. So I was able to make this little video. So I'll show you Chloe's deer migrating, and then you'll see our cat coming online here. This is in the West Okanagan, close to Summerland. She's migrating again back to her summer range. So this is our cougar. You can see she moves a lot more than the mule deer does. So the mule deer really didn't move very much within her summer or winter home range. But the cougar's searching pretty far to look for prey, and she passes her a few times before she gets her right on that X. So that was pretty exciting for everybody involved in these projects to see all of this come together and how much we will be able to learn over the course of the 2 projects. Another cool thing I want to show you is that the same cat actually had 3 subadults with her at that time. So We didn't have them collared, I believe, at the time, but Sam Foster's camera grid picked up this same cat in that area, and one of his volunteers sent me the photo. So her collar wasn't working very well at the time in the summer, so I didn't know she was there, but he picked her up, and she had these 2 subadults, and there's another photo with a 3rd one, and we were able to collar 2 of the subadults in the summertime. So they were about a year old, and we were able to catch their dispersal event away from their mother and away from each other. So that was really exciting for us. It was a young female and a young male. So that's the female here, and she's still collared on the project. And I'll just show you this video, and the cat, the mother is still in blue. You can see her C5, and then 22 and 21 are the male and female. You'll see they stick together initially, and then you'll see them separate, and then they don't see each other again after this. So there's mom, she's looking for food, meets up with the young, and there go the brother and sister. So the female dispersed south, the male spent a bit more time with his mother, but not much more, and then he actually crossed and went north of the connector. So they went completely different directions. So we were able to capture that moment of dispersal. And we're still monitoring this female. She ended up going all the way to the Princeton area. Okay, so looking at more of the diet component of the project. So apart from reproduction and using habitat, what are they eating? So what are cougars eating? Where do they eat them and when? We want to look at these GPS clusters that I talked about before and learn about their prey selection and their kill rates. So on average, this is across most cougar studies, but cougars kill about 1 deer-sized prey per week. But that varies with season and prey availability. We want to know exactly that. So seasonal differences. We want to know if cougars might be specializing as well on certain prey. So is the reason that mule deer are in decline more in certain areas, does that have anything to do with cougars targeting mule deer in particular, or are they eating them or consuming them the same amount we would expect based on how many deer there are in the population? So that's important to look at. We can identify factors that increase mule deer predation risk from cougars. So looking at the habitat characteristics and the terrain, are mule deer more susceptible to cougar predation if they're near certain features on the landscape compared to other animals? So what is it about that event that made a cougar kill a mule deer? I'm just showing you a couple of photos here. This is shearing that cougars do, and smaller cats do this too, but to a lesser extent. They shear the hair right off their prey and they cache them with their own hair, so it's pretty gruesome. They also do this with snow and bits of woody debris to really hide their prey from other scavengers. So we go in and we hike into GPS clusters. We collect the jaw, we collect samples for this. I'll just show you here. So we do this year round as well. So we're trying to not only collect predation rates in the winter, but also the summer. We're collecting hair samples from the prey, cougar scat, because using this GPS method, and this is an important point, we go into clusters when they're 10 to 12 hours at least in duration. So there's just so many cougar kills, we can't possibly go to every minor cluster of 2 points that are together. Otherwise, we would need hundreds of people. So I wish we could do that, but we don't really have the capacity. So one way we're trying to get at the rest of the diet that they consume, because cougars don't spend 2 days consuming a snowshoe hare. They will spend 2 days or more consuming a deer or a moose or elk. We can collect their scat at bed sites that we find. So often they lay down if they're unsuccessful or they're resting, and they might hunt other things during that time, and we can collect their scat and see what's in the scat, and that could be other small prey. So just remember that a lot of the data that I'm showing is biased towards larger prey that cougars spend a lot of time eating, and that's what we're putting the cameras on too. So we're also looking at bone marrow from the prey, so we can look at body condition of all of these different ungulates. So are cougars predating deer that are in poor body condition, or are they actually relatively healthy? We can look at habitat characteristics, remote cameras for scavengers. And we can also see if cougars are scavenging each other's kills. So if we put up a camera to detect animals coming in like black bears and coyotes, are we getting cougars there too? And are they wearing a collar? We can get information like that. So again, just showing you the breakdown of what we're finding at clusters. This is also majority of ungulate species. We're not picking up as many of those small animals that they do eat. But to date, we have visited 530 GPS clusters. And an important point to make is that they're not always kills. So we find kills about 60% of the time when we go to a cluster site. And the rest of the time, it's either something they're scavenging, they are bedded down for the night, or in some cases, they were den sites of a female with kittens. But what I want to show you here is a breakdown of those larger animals that we found and the differences between the study areas. So I'll just show you here, this figure includes 12 animals that we collared in the West Okanagan, just 1 cat from the boundary and 10 from the Kootenays. So it doesn't include all of our cats. Like I said, we had a collar drop off. We had a couple of cats that died and some collar failures. So I didn't get a lot of diet information from every cat that we collared, but we got as much as we could. So I'll just show you here, the mule deer seem to be a huge component of the clusters that we've gone to. So a lot of the times in the West Okanagan, we go in and we find a mule deer. We've had a few instances of whitetails. We have quite a few unknowns. So we know it's a deer, but all we found was some hair or a few bone fragments, and we might have to send our hair samples in to know what species it was. So it can be very, very difficult, even with a microscope, to see the difference between mule deer and white-tailed deer hair. In the boundary, it's about 50-50, but just from 1 cat, her diet was mostly deer and some moose. Again, also moose in the West Okanagan to a larger extent. In the Kootenays, far fewer moose and a lot more elk. So we only had 1 elk predated in the West Okanagan, but that might have to do with there being not very many elk there. In the Kootenays, there are a lot of elk and a lot of whitetails, and we're finding those are the 2 main ungulates that are predated there, and mule deer predated to a lesser extent by our cats. And here I want to show you some of the weird stuff we found hiking into cougar clusters. So it's not always just a deer carcass, although that's what we find a lot of the time. At one site, we found a cat spent 8 days on a porcupine that she killed. And my guess was that she injured herself or she couldn't figure out how to eat it because she was only a year old. So that was cool to find quills and the carcass there. We had a snowshoe hare. One of our males in the Kootenays, he likely predated this cougar kitten. So we actually found a cougar kitten carcass at one of these clusters in the Kootenays from one of our males. And a different male also killed a coyote, so that was cool. And in this case down here, there was a double kill by a small female in the Okanagan where she had predated a moose and consumed that moose, and then right afterwards killed a mule deer right beside it. So she cached a fresh mule deer. We put up a camera to find out if there are other cats that she's traveling with. Maybe it's more than 1 cat. But we've had a couple instances with multiple kills, but usually they weren't both fresh. There might be an old kill and a new kill. This middle one down here was from one of our cougars that predated a doe right before fawns were dropping, and she buried the fetus. So she consumed all of the mother, and then we were looking around the kill and we thought this was organs, and we scooped out this white-tailed deer fetus that the cougar decided it didn't want to eat at the time. And lastly, this bottom one, this was a case where an elk got tangled up in a fence and our cougar came and ate some of it, or looked like it scavenged this kill. It looked like the elk was pretty emaciated at the time and the kill was older than when our cat came in. So scavenging evidence. Okay, so just to show you some preliminary stuff on age. So we are looking at the age of prey that we find, and in the spring and summer, we've had quite a few fawns or calves predated by cougars. So you can see this breakdown here. We do have some unknowns. Again, sometimes we have very little to go on, like Chloe showed, just some bone fragments. What I do want to show you here is that because the majority of our cougars are female, that would be GPS collared, they don't tend to take down adult moose. It's mostly larger cougars, like big toms that can take down big prey. So our females are killing moose, but generally yearlings or calves. Same thing with the elk. There are fewer larger adult elk predated than the younger ones. And I think that's just because the female cougars are smaller and they're less capable of taking down such large prey. We can also look at the sex ratios. So I would expect cougars to predate more does during the spring when they're giving birth, and it's just so energetically costly. They just went through winter and all their energy is going into giving birth to these fawns. So I would suspect that they would be more susceptible to cougar predation during that time versus male deer may be more susceptible in the rut when they're hyped up on hormones and ready to mate. So we are picking up some differences across seasons, but I don't have any results across seasons just yet. But we are collecting things like bone marrow from the femurs in the field. We can look at body condition. So those are our samples. You can see the kind of brighter pink ones compared to browner or whiter ones are healthier, but we get the dry mass of those. And we also collect teeth so we can get a more accurate age estimate. So in the previous figure, I showed you sort of a basic breakdown, and we'll actually send away teeth to get the true age of these deer and other prey. Okay, so the last objective is to measure the effects of scavengers. I've been talking about how we've been putting up cameras at the kills. So what are we getting at these sites? We're trying to calculate species diversity and richness. I want to know more about the interactions between cougars and these other predators. What is the influence of black bears on cougar predation rates of mule deer? There was a study done in Washington, or California actually, recently that showed black bears had a huge impact on cougar predation rates because they were stealing so much of their food. But we also have other predators here. We have lots of coyotes. We have wolves, primarily in the Kootenays, but also in some other areas in the boundary too. We can look at interactions at these kills and if that has any effect on predation rates. So this is just a figure showing a sample. So not all of the cameras that we put out. I haven't gotten there yet, but we have classified about 30 cameras so far. And this just shows a breakdown of all the scavengers that are showing up at these kills. So I haven't broken this down by study area. So when I have all of the data collected over a few years, we'll divide this by study area and look at some trends. We can look at it by season, but for now, this is just all of the data that we've detected. But what I want to point out here is that we've gotten, of course, cougars coming into their own kills. And the gray bar here as unclassified means that these are the collared cougars. So they're not scavenging. This is a figure about scavenging behavior. This is their own kill, but the orange is other cougars coming in to these kills and being detected on the cameras. So it might be the young of a female, it might be a mate, it might be a totally different cat weeks later coming in. I put the cameras up for about 30 days and I try to put them on kills that are less than a week old so that there's lots of meat left. But another big player here is coyotes, and coyotes are there at nearly every kill. So they seem to be a big player. There's usually more than one coyote coming into the kills. And this data is from about February, March to June of last year. So once we get more data classified, I'll expect black bears to be more prominent on this graph because we had black bears at pretty much every site outside of the hibernation period. So black bears were pretty much always there. There was one time I walked up to a kill and there were black bears on the kill and it was like a 3-week-old kill. So I don't know why they were hanging out there. There wasn't any meat left at all, but yeah, we've had a couple of run-ins with bears doing this. We also had a large number of ravens and other birds of prey. So just showing you how diverse the communities are. There are many other species that I've seen on the cameras, but are not present on this graph, and we haven't classified them yet. So just to show you how many players there are in consuming the food the cougars kill. And I get this a lot from my technicians, and they say, oh, I don't need to put a camera up if there's hardly anything left, right? And I just want to show you how strong the scent is even of a carcass in the bush and how that attracts so many different animals over time. So this is just a quick video showing you the diversity of species coming into this elk carcass that seemingly has no meat left. So I also just want to thank Grant Hebert right now because he gave us a fabulous donation of camera guards so that the bears can't destroy all of our cameras. So that was awesome. As you can see, we did have coyotes drag away the carcass in that case, but the bears do this too. So we do have some challenges working with this data sometimes where the animals just pull the carcass out of the frame, but we do the best that we can. Okay, so next steps for the project, we have a goal of collaring 30 animals. So we've got 26, but we're going to hopefully collar more animals in the boundary next year. We're continuing our cluster site investigations into year 2. We're hiring a new team for the summer. And we're going to look at integrating more of our project with the Southern Interior Mule Deer Project and calculating timing of the scavengers of the kills, working with the scavenging data, and just getting all of this camera data classified. And I'll be doing a lot of statistical models in my future. So again, we're only just over a year in, so there's a lot left to do in the project, but please stay tuned for future updates when we have more to show you. So to finish off, we're collecting really important baseline data here for cougars. So it's been a long time since a cougar study of this size has occurred in British Columbia, especially when investigating so many different elements of their ecology. We're looking to improve statistical models, enable some long-term monitoring, and really understand more about their habitat use and their predation patterns, and how or when or if they might be limiting mule deer in some way. Also, the findings of this project will help inform the upcoming provincial cougar management plan. So that's being updated or is in the process of being updated, and our data can really be helpful in making a plan to manage cougars in the future. So a couple of ways that folks can get involved. So if you guys see a cougar in the winter or fresh tracks, you can email or call us, let us know, because we certainly are far more successful capturing and collaring cougars when we get some sort of lead. So if someone's seen cougar tracks recently, that's really helpful for us. It's very difficult to search all these different roads to find cougar tracks just on our own. So that's one way that folks can help us out. Hopefully there'll be opportunities to volunteer in the future. We unfortunately have been very limited because of COVID-19 regulations, but we're really hopeful that moving forward, there will be opportunities to get people out and helping us collect this important data. You can also make donations to the project. Like I said, we need more money for cameras, and we are fortunate that we have lots of bear guards now. So the more equipment we can get to monitor these animals, the better. And if you guys are out hunting or you have a cougar sighting and you see a cougar that's tagged, they all have numbers. So you can report that you saw one of our cougars and let us know. Okay, so there's all kinds of wonderful people that are involved in this project, and some of them are in this presentation and listening in today. So I want to thank my supervisors, Adam and Karen, TJ Goliath, who is an important piece of this research with the provincial government, also Patrick Stent, and all of our technicians, houndsmen and women, community volunteers, people who have donated, and all of our funders. So it's a huge collaboration, and I think it'll continue to grow from here. So I really just want to say a big thank you, and we couldn't do it without all of these wonderful people. Okay, so sorry for talking for too long. I really love talking about cougars, so I apologize for going over the time.
I don't think anybody minded, Siobhan. That was an excellent presentation. It's sure nice to see some of that work come together with the data and the collections of cameras and the photos. And I can't believe how much I haven't seen. So I'm going to start to promote some of our participants to panelists. That's going to give them an opportunity to have both audio and video coming online. If they have posted a question anonymously, I'll read it out to you. And so I'm just going to bring Steve on. Steve, give me a quick second. So we're going to try to run through this in 30 minutes. Both Siobhan and Chloe are going to answer as needed. And again, participants, if we run over time, then I will have a copy of all of your Q&As, and I will be sending you out contact information for Siobhan and Chloe at the end of the webinar. So you can feel free to reach out and ask your questions. Steve, are you with us? I'll just ask him to unmute. Otherwise, I will read his question. Okay, what about wolves, as they kill a lot more and also travel long distances and can cause mule deer to leave their wintering grounds, which may cause starvation as well? Cougars do not tend to push herds of deer around as much.
Yeah, okay, that's clearly a question for me. So I would say, and this is something that's been surprising to a lot of people when I present our mortality numbers and predation causes, but we've only had 6 guaranteed, or not guaranteed, but 6 identified wolf kills out of 81 total predations. So I would say that wolves, at least in our 3 study areas, don't seem to be having as large an impact when it comes to predation, certainly less than cougars. There's 42 versus 6. And it is possible perhaps that they are chasing these the deer outside of their winter ranges, and then they die later on. And that's a good point, and something I haven't thought too much about, but I think we could tease that apart just by looking at the deer, and this is something I will do, is looking at the deer locations before they die. So what habitats are they using, and is it in their home ranges that they were using before? So we could kind of answer this by looking like, okay, their location that they died, how far was that from the location in which they lived? And then we could perhaps theorize that maybe that was related to wolves pushing them, although we wouldn't really know. But yeah, I would just say, I think it is always surprising to people because I know wolves do have a large impact on moose in other parts of the province, but it seems like for mule deer, it really is cougars and not as many wolves. So hopefully
thank you. There's another question that's come from Steve as well. Have you collaborated with Wild Sheep BC to learn more about cougars? It is believed that they have done some studies as well. Siobhan, that might be one for you. Wild Sheep and any cougar studies there?
Sorry, my connection just cut out partway through the question. If I look at the question and answer, is it in there?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Steve Rochon.
Steve. Something about Wild Sheep Society. I will say that we did reach out to the Wild Sheep Society, so we are in early discussions about collaborating with them. We've had one bighorn sheep predated by a cougar on our study so far, and it was actually the cat lost the kill immediately. So we only learned it was her because we went and investigated the sheep mortality. It was collared, and her locations were up on a ridge up above the kill. So we put 2 and 2 together and figured she must have killed this sheep, but at the actual kill, there was only bear scat everywhere. So we think that she was pushed off right away by probably more than one bear because there was just so much bear sign, several beds, several piles of scat. So we are looking for potential to collaborate with them. Most of our cats don't overlap with sheep at the moment. So I hope that got at some of the question.
That's perfect. Nathan.
Hi guys. This one's more directed towards Chloe, but it will definitely, this might be something I don't know if Siobhan's aware of, or she may have something to say about it. This was from an earlier webinar where I got to listen to Dr. Valerie Geist, and he has a very interesting theory on something he calls a predator pit theory. Cougars don't seem, he never did mention cougars, he mostly mentioned wolves and bears. And that with his theory, the control and management of bears, whether it be actually both black bear and grizzly bear, depending on the environment you're talking about, play a huge role in allowing ungulates and other prey animals to bounce back, because of both the amount of forage that the bears consume in an area that has been pushed around by wolves, and not only that, but the amount of young that they consume while they're roaming around foraging for vegetation. They happen to find fawns and calves. And the effect, because I know you mentioned some of these test areas where they did population control on cougars and coyotes, I didn't hear any mention of bears. So according to Dr. Valerie Geist, the bear situation in BC, and you talk to First Nations, you talk to hunters, you talk to COs, and as Siobhan just mentioned, the bear population in BC is nowhere near a low number. I mean, you can spend a day up by Prince George. I'll see 40 bears a day, and I'll maybe see 2 deer a day if I'm lucky. So I guess the question is really, do you, both of you, feel that increasing, or at the very least trying to maintain, bear harvest would be beneficial to ungulates, the bears themselves, and also perhaps even to cougars?
I can go first if you want, Chloe.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can't really speak to, I guess, what I think should be done regarding the harvest regulations. I think the first step would be to do a study on bears. Like I said, with my work so far, we're seeing bears on pretty much every cougar kill. And we want to really look at the influence of bears affecting, you know, through the scavenging and stealing cougar food, what the effect that might have on predation rates by cougars. But I think that's fair. We have seen as many as 6 or 7 different bears come into one cougar kill. And I just looked at the camera and there's different color fur, and you know, it's totally different individuals, and some of them back to back. So it seems to be there are quite a few bears, but we would really have to have a study where we can put out cameras, and that might be something that Sam can get at with relative abundance of bears. So he is picking up bears on his cameras, and from early discussions with him, it seems like he's also had a lot of bears show up on his camera. So the first step would be to kind of get at those numbers of bears, and then, you know, do the science behind that to make recommendations. That's not something, it's a bit outside of what Chloe and I are looking at, but certainly room for somebody else to take on a project on bears, I think. I don't know what you think, Chloe.
Yeah, well, I think this is a good point in how complicated these relationships are, right? Because if we look at just the deer numbers alone, like looking at, again, like the deer predation and what we've seen, bears have very little impact on adult or even 6-month-old juvenile survival. We've had really not that many bear predations there, and then we did see some definitely during the neonate season. And so at face value, it would seem like, okay, bears don't really appear to be having that big of an impact. But then if we think about how bears might be pushing cougars off their kill, and perhaps that's why we see so high numbers of cougar kills in some regions. Maybe it's because there are more bears. And so, yeah, I guess this just shows really how complicated this can be, because it could be as simple as, yeah, let's just, you know, try and reduce the bear population, and maybe that will have a positive impact on deer, but it also might not, right? So, yeah, it's really hard to say, but I would say, well, I don't know. I don't want to speak for bear biologists, because I'm not a bear biologist, so I can't speak to like how that would impact bear populations to keep them healthy. But it does seem like there's like room for bear harvest for sure. They're not hurting. But in terms of what impact that would have on the deer, it's really hard to say. Yeah, could be positive and also could have no impact at all. Just given how complicated these relationships seem to be.
Excellent question, Nathan. Nathan, I see you've got some more questions up there. I'm going to pop over to Daryl first, and then if we have more time, otherwise, Nathan, I'll make sure to connect you with Siobhan and Chloe, but we probably will have a few minutes. Daryl, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Excellent.
I have a question for each of you two. I'd like to first start to say thanks for being with us tonight. I appreciate you spending your evening with us. So first is Siobhan, you talked a little bit about citizen science. I live in the Creston area. I know it's a little bit out of your region, but how valuable is citizen science to the biologists of British Columbia? Because I hear conflicting stories of its value. So I would like to hear from you. How important is citizen science in collecting data?
Really valuable. I mean, I've worked with citizen science in several other capacities outside of this project. So I've worked a lot with eBird and eBird data. So I'm a birder also, and birders across all of North America and the world contribute a ton of data, but it's a system that took decades to really get off the ground so that the data is usable for biologists. So citizen science is a really amazing tool. It just takes a really long time for that data to be kind of massaged, and observations have to be checked over and that sort of thing. But one of the things I'm interested in thinking about as I work on my project in the next few years is trying to harness more information from hunters in the community, because when I go out and chase cougars and to collar them, I think about hunters and the tales that they tell me, and I saw this cougar track with kittens a couple weeks ago, and that's information that I don't hear about unless I talk to a hunter. So I guess my question for you is there a system or an app or a citizen science project that hunters use where you could report sightings that someone like me could use? Because there are programs like iNaturalist and other systems where you can report sightings, and then I can know, there's a female with kittens in this area that we didn't know about. Because it can be hard for us to know what's out there. We don't have all the eyes and ears that you guys do.
Right. So the reason I ask is I'm going to propose, I'm president of the Rod and Gun Club in Creston, and I'm going to ask my membership to report any wildlife sightings to our website. So it'll be kind of initially it'll be a rough start for us, just to collect the data. But, and I'm not going to ask guys for a GPS position initially, because guys don't want to give up their secrets. But, if we can get a number of cougars or bears or deer that are in say 4-5 or 4-6 or 4-7, I think it'll be a big help, a big start to of where we're going, or of our wildlife situation.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I think that there is, a need for a system for the hunting community to report sightings that works for them. I know there are a couple of different apps that have been floating around for moose reportings and in certain regions, but having something that works where, you don't want to give up your location to everyone you know, but maybe that data is obscured and a researcher like me could access it, something like that. So I think there's a lot of potential in the future for citizen science and getting the hunting community involved with it for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Awesome question.
Okay. And Chloe, my second question is for you. You mentioned that hunters put out $130 million a year. I think you said for mule deer. I know that's a best guess. Would it be beneficial to the biologists in BC if the government would put a value on our wildlife? And I say that because I've read several studies out of the States, Idaho, Washington State, Montana. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, they put a value on their game animals, and I'd like to know if that would be beneficial to you if our government knew the value of our animals.
Yeah, well, I think I don't want to say the biggest hurdle, but to me it feels like the biggest hurdle for wildlife management in BC is the lack of funding. And I would say I don't think it has to just be game animals, because there's a lot of species out there that people don't hunt, and I think they still have intrinsic value as well. But yeah, I think definitely more funding would help fix a lot of problems, at least from just like a base monitoring standpoint. Like there's a lot of species in this province that we don't really know what's happening with them because we don't have money to monitor them. And it's always difficult to get a tax passed. So luckily in the US, one of the things they did well was implement that Pittman-Robinson tax. So it's like a certain percentage of all firearm sales and ammunition goes towards wildlife research. And they've been able to do some amazing things because they have that money guaranteed to them every single year. And I think here, to me, I think it'd be great if we could expand that beyond just hunting, so that everyone's contributing to the resource base, right? So if we have a tax on binoculars, so that people who are into birding and then also people that go elk hunting, they're all contributing to the resource as well. So yeah, definitely more money would really help a lot of things.
Yeah, I know we're shortchanged on, you know, you shouldn't have to go to the government with hat in hand every time you want to do a project. I think that's unfair to you and to Savan. I think that's unfair to the two of you and all the other biologists. But yeah, I would just like to know if maybe if we had a value on our wildlife, the government would wake up and recognize what an asset we have walking around the province. It's you know, I don't think they give it any value except for what the environmentalists are screaming about.
Yeah, I think unfortunately timber companies, they see the value in timber and perhaps not so much in the species that live within those forests. So yeah.
Awesome questions, gang.
Okay, thank you.
Andrew, are you with us?
Yeah, you bet. Can you hear me all right there, Amberly?
We sure can. Yeah, thanks for joining us.
I jumped on there with the video earlier. Just gonna speak to Daryl just about using citizen science. There's a couple little blurbs came up here in the chat, but we do have a moose tracker app here in BC specifically for monitoring moose, and I think there's a ton of potential also to expand that, but it just really requires a lot of people using it, which is, you know, getting that volunteer. I mean, hunters especially are a little protectionist about, you know, kind of sharing that kind of information maybe, but there is opportunity there for sure. Sorry for that little distraction.
That's awesome. Appreciate that.
Oh, my question. Yes, I did have a question too. Sorry, Chloe, this is directed towards you. Just around, you know, what are most other jurisdictions? You know, the majority of our mule deer are obviously migratory, and you know, we've got a lot going on here in the U.S. That are promoting migratory mule deer, and I'm just curious, you know, like your perspective on what you think these other jurisdictions are doing to kind of protect and promote those migratory herds that they have.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think yeah, we can learn a lot from other places. And so I actually read the other day the Idaho strategic mule deer management plan for 2020 to 2026. And I'd actually recommend if anyone's interested, you can just Google it and have a read, because there's also just a lot of good information in there about mule deer. But anyways, in Idaho specifically, so they were the ones that did that big predation study where they did a bunch of predator control, and they pretty much moved past predator control to manage their mule deer. And so they're really focusing a lot on habitat management is kind of their biggest thing. So partnering with, the way their land management works is a bit different. They have to partner with different federal government agencies to promote that. So they've been doing things like promoting juniper management, like aspen restoration, things like that. So trying to get people to do some restoration on the ground. And then they've also put a lot of money into research and into monitoring. So they keep about something crazy, 6,000 deer over the whole state, collared every single year, just to keep monitoring their survival. And then they have these fancy population models that they use. And so anyways, they have a lot of money, and I think they're using it in a pretty neat way. Yeah, and then other states, so Colorado, they do have some localized predator management stuff, but in pretty small regions. So it's not over the entire state. They have done a little bit of bear, I think bear management, increasing bear harvest. Yeah, and then in Wyoming, they also do a lot of research in Wyoming, and they have spent a lot of time looking at mule deer migrations. And they have a lot of energy development. And so they spend a lot of time trying to mitigate those wind energy, and not just wind energy, oil and gas, and try to mitigate those effects on mule deer winter range, because that has a large impact there. And then also their migrations, there's been some really neat stories in the news about how they've created a bunch of overpasses and underpasses to keep those long distance migrants. That's where they had the 400-kilometer migrant there. So yeah, it's a lot of states are doing a lot of habitat stuff, keeping migration corridors intact, and then there is some predator control happening in some states, but it's not like sharpshooting of wolves or anything like that. It's more just like increasing harvest in certain specific areas where they think it's impacting survival.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks you guys.
Awesome. Neil, are you around?
Hi, Amber. Hi.
Hi.
You see me? Question for Siobhan. There's a theory, at least among hunters, that if hunters concentrate their harvest on older male cougars, it seems, and ignore the 80 to 90 pound females, fair enough. But the theory being that it actually can result in an increased overall cougar population because of reduced infanticide by the large males. Is there any evidence of that in your research? And you only mentioned the one cub infanticide.
Yeah, good question. So there's been a bit more research on this in Washington and Oregon and Idaho. So it'll be something we can try to get at with our project. Again, we're in the early stages and we haven't had that many males collared on the project. So I think part of that is because males have larger territories and there tends to be several male or females per male. So we tend to encounter more females when we're going out and looking for tracks. But there has been some evidence that overharvesting of cougars destabilizes the population. So if you take out too many adult males, more immigrant males come in and they basically share that larger established male's territory. And it's the younger males that cause infanticide by moving in from these neighboring areas and kill off the young of the female. So I think the harvest in the literature, it's about 40% harvest of the female and adult male population leads to some of this instability. So I think for the government regulations, they target something like 10 to 15% harvest. So that we're well below that instability threshold. But we can look to see exactly where we're at a bit more with this research, because it's really hard to know where we're sitting if we don't know how many cougars there are. So trying to get at that question.
Excellent. Thanks, Siobhan.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks a lot. Great question, Neil. Grant, are you with us? Maybe
Sure,
not.
How's that?
Oh, hello.
There
We
you
got
go.
ya.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much to both presenters. A ton of good information handed out tonight in a very understandable format. So thank you again very much. And I just had one little question. We have what appears to be a resident female cat wandering our area, but it's slightly north of Siobhan's region. And I was just wondering if she's interested or she's specifically targeting cats within those regions, or whether there's an opportunity to go slightly outside of it.
We are doing the best we can to stay within the regions where the mule deer are collared. So we have no control over where the cats go after we collar them. We had one cat that did this really cool migration. She was hanging out in Summerland with, we think, her mother. We collared both of them. And she went up towards like the Peachland area back and forth. And then she did this big jump across the valley, went all the way up to the Granby, hit Arrow Lake, followed Arrow Lake for a while, and then came all the way back and is now on the east side of the valley. So we have no control over where she went. She actually went to our boundary study area, and now she's in between both of our study areas. So we're still using that data that we collect, but we are trying to collar them in the study area and hope, fingers crossed, that they stick around. We also had a cat go all the way down to halfway down Washington, and she never came back. Well, it's long gone. But if your cat is kind of within our study area, absolutely. If it's outside, we really are trying to focus on trying to keep them where we are.
That's fair enough. Thank you very much, both of you.
Ladies, this has been an amazing evening, and it's 8:55 p.m. I know that there are still some outstanding questions, but we have gone 2 hours. And so I'm going to make sure that I email out those remaining questions to you two. We'll get them addressed, and then we will make sure that that the folks that have asked them are getting some answers. As well, I'll remind participants that I am going to be sending you some contact information for both Siobhan and Chloe, so that we can get through for you guys to have a chat with these ladies directly. And I just want to say, on behalf of all of us, what a great evening, and you guys did an excellent job. I don't get tired of hearing Chloe. I think I've heard you 3 or 4 times now. I'm not tired of it. Siobhan, way to launch. You know, I just loved it, and you did a great job tonight. So I am going to say thank you to everybody. Watch your emails for the information that I have promised. And I'm going to wish you all an amazing good night. Siobhan and Chloe, anything else to add before we go?
Just thank you everybody for listening. This is one of my first talks on the project, so it's great to have an audience. I hope that in the future I can give a talk in person to all the different groups out there. So thank you for listening.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I, like Amberly said, I've given a similar talk many times. So I'm hoping that in the coming months, I can give a different talk with some different information and have some more answers. So anyways, stay tuned.
Chloe, I think I learned something every time I watch your presentation, so it's not lost on the repeats and the information, and we know the good stuff is yet to come. Just a quick reminder to my remaining attendees, we are fundraising for these 2 projects. We are really hoping to contribute to cameras, camera batteries, SD cards, and things like that. You will find a donation button on our social media and on our website. And I hope you can see it upon yourself to head on over there and make a small donation to contribute to some science in BC. Once again, ladies, thank you so much, and have a great night, everybody.
Great. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.